times and studying Lama Tsongkhapa's teaching. We're actually in the section on related to bodhicitta. So we already covered the section where Lama Tsongkhapa discusses that there are two actual methods for generating bodhicitta, right? So one is, the first one he taught was the method that begins with recollecting the kindness of mother sentient beings, right? So when, actually it begins with contemplating the kindness of one's mother in this life, and then viewing all sentient beings as having been one's mother in past lives, and cultivating gratitude, and the wish to repay their kindness, and then love, compassion, and bodhicitta. And then the second method Tsongkhapa taught was that equalizing and exchanging self with others, from Shantideva. So now we're in the section, and then we covered how you, if once one has cultivated some degree of, some amount of bodhicitta, some degree of bodhicitta in one's heart, right, through love and compassion, and we just covered how you take the bodhisattva vow, especially the aspiring vow. And then now we're in a section on how do you not lose bodhicitta in this life and in future lives. And so last time I covered, we talked about the 4 negative actions. He kind of covers it as, in terms of how not to, how not to lose track of bodhicitta in this life and also in future lives. Lama Tsongkhapa presents 4 negative actions and 4 positive actions. He calls them black and white. And so I'm going to last time we went over the 4 black actions, but I'm going to cover them again in the context of the 4 white actions and sort of explain that together. Okay, so I'll start with the 4 white actions. Let's cover the 4 white actions, but I'll mention the 4 black ones again. And so the negative action, right, that harms one's bodhicitta, that I mentioned last time, is lying to one's lama, one's guru, one's spiritual teacher. So the white action that kind of is the opposite of that, or that one cultivates to prevent that, is simply not lying, so being an honest person. Okay? So and that one, the way Lama Tsongkhapa explains it, he says is, in other words, not just not lying to one's spiritual teacher, but not developing the habit of lying, right? In other words, by being honest with everyone, all sentient beings. And he makes the point, he says, even as a joke, like, in other words, it's really cultivating a habit of honesty. Is what he's talking about here. And he says, and he makes this point, right? He says, if you don't lie to anybody, then you're not going to lie to your spiritual teacher, right? So you're not developing that karmic habit, and then it's easier to be a straightforward, honest person. So that's the first one. Then the second one, and it's important to distinguish these. They're similar but different in a significant way. So the second one is, he says, abiding in the extraordinary attitude without deceit or shiftiness is how the outline describes it. So again, the second one, the object is all sentient beings, wherever you meet. But this one has a couple parts to it. So one is, it says, abiding in the extraordinary attitude. So that means, right, whoever you meet, the extraordinary attitude in this case is that attitude of, of universal responsibility, in other words, of altruism. So this one includes 2 parts. One is, as you go around in daily life, you cultivate a sense of altruism, of compassion, of loving kindness, and particularly a feeling of, a lot of times we have this sense of either simple self-centeredness, or sort of a sense of others aren't my problem, something like that, right? So this extraordinary attitude says, others' well-being is my responsibility. Right? There's being of service to others, helping others, is my responsibility. So it's the opposite of that. Right? So one goes around with not just a sense of compassion, but a sense of compassion combined with some sense of responsibility for the well-being of those we come in contact with. And then in that context, Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying, and it's teaching from the Buddha, what he's getting at here, he said, the translator calls it without being deceitful or shifty. This is different than not lying. I mean, the not lying one already came. We already explained that. This one is like being sincere, so being heartfelt. Right? And I think this is an important one because part of what this is getting at, of course, is being heartfelt with others. I'm trying to say this the right way. Sometimes, particularly if one is cultivating a sense of loving kindness and compassion, one can turn that into one's sort of, what's the say right, ego trip or something. You know, like I'm such a compassionate person. Oh, look how nice I am. Oh, like that. And this is saying that we have to introspect, to catch ourselves, and stop. Does that make sense? So there is if one's let's say it right. You know, there's a difference between actually being loving and compassionate in one's heart, and becoming attached to putting on the appearance of being a loving, compassionate person. Does that make sense? Which is just another kind of facade or another. And actually, it's quite important, isn't it? Because the first one, in other words, genuine love and compassion, lead to a sense of energy, of joy, of deep engagement with others, and of satisfaction. Whereas if we get caught up in the one that's what he's calling, you know, shifty or deceitful or, you know, image-based or something, that's where then you end up, what's the word, after a while feeling resentful. Like you think, well, I'm doing all this and, you know, and nobody's really appreciating it or something, or I'm not, or, and there's also always a sense of underlying anxiety, like others won't see you that way, you know, and then, so it's not actually, so if what you're worried about is others seeing you as loving rather than being loving, if you're concerned with sort of presenting, sometimes it's just seeing yourself, right? Like you have some kind of idea, I want to present myself as loving so that I'm convinced I'm this loving person. Right? But then there's always this insecurity there, right? Well, am I really being loving? Do others see that I'm loving? It's this kind of neurotic kind of state of mind. And so what Lama Tsongkhapa here is pointing out, right, is if you cultivate actual love and compassion, then you're good, right? That's the point. Whereas if it's another, and actually I'll make another point here, because part of this is also not losing bodhicitta in future lives. Right? And part of the idea behind this is if you're just caught up, if you end up letting yourself get sucked into, in a way, a self-image trip, well then it's just a self-image trip and you'll substitute something else for that, right? One time, you know, whereas if it's like, I've got to be the most loving, then another time it'll be, I have to be the most rich or the most attractive or the most powerful or the most, it's just a story. Does that make sense? A competitive story with other people. So that's not actually a spiritual practice, right, anymore. And so, so the second one is quite important in that sense, right? It's like really introspecting and saying, you know, so when it says not to be deceitful or shifty, what it's really getting at is looking inside yourself and saying, am I being simple and straightforward? And is my love or my compassion or my bodhicitta genuine or not? And if it's not, then you just stop, right? You say, wait, correct it, right? I'm not, which is actually liberating. Does that make sense? In the moment, it's quite liberating to just let go of this word needing to get other people to see you a certain way or needing to sort of sustain a certain self-image or something like that, right? Rather than just saying, all I have to do is cultivate love in my heart. That's not complicated. There's something quite simple about that. So the second one is getting at that sort of dynamic. And you see the difference between that and lying. The first one was just simple lying, right? Like, you know, literally saying untruths. This one you may not be lying, right? But there's a kind of, what's the word? It's caught up in a self-image. That's really the way I would describe it, right? Or caught up in sort of trying to project something rather than being heartfelt. So that's that one. Okay, then the third one of these four that are like, he calls the white dharmas, the positive things to not harm your bodhicitta, is, he says, I'll read the outline first, generating the discrimination or seeing, viewing bodhisattvas as being like the Buddha himself and praising those bodhisattvas. So this one is related to the negative action of insulting bodhisattvas, right? And so remember, like, if we're trying to cultivate bodhicitta, right, we're trying to appreciate bodhicitta and appreciate the bodhisattva's way of life. So if you find people who are actually practicing that, who are living a life of compassion and service and kindness and striving for enlightenment and you're insulting them while trying to appreciate bodhicitta, of course, there's a contradiction there, right? So here, first, there are a number of points Lama Tsongkhapa makes about this idea of like respecting bodhisattvas and praising them. So this one is not focused on all sentient beings; it's focused specifically on bodhisattvas. That's one point he makes. And then he says, when he makes one point. He says, when you come across a bodhisattva, he says it's best if you can to see them as the Buddha or as like the Buddha. That's the kind of respect. Of course, if they're a bodhisattva, they're striving to become a Buddha, and they have the main cause of becoming a Buddha, which is bodhicitta. So in that sense, it's reasonable to view them as like the teacher, like the Buddha. And then he says, and his advice, in this context, is proclaim truthful praise about them in the four directions. And then I thought this was funny. In one of the commentaries, it said, the point is that when you see somebody doing good things and practicing love, compassion, and bodhicitta, appreciate them, respect them, and praise those actions to others. And it says, since the line says in the four directions, meaning like north, south, east, and west, the commentary said, if you don't literally walk in all four directions to do it, that's fine. I thought that was funny. They were getting at people who take things too literally, right? What it's getting at is whenever you can, praise that kind of activity. I thought that was like preventing overly literal interpretation. But it's to really get the idea there, right? Again, it's because the issue is not some kind of like, what they were getting at is a psychological thing also, right? How we sometimes become rigid. The idea is in your heart to appreciate that kind of thing and just to tell the person that, right? Because actually you know that, right? Sometimes, first of all, for the person themselves, it's encouraging them to continue doing, when you see somebody doing a positive action, I make the point about that. We often, actually, if you check, like, if you observe, like, in your interactions with other people, right, how often is the focus of the conversation, like, what you or the other person think other people are doing wrong, right? And this could apply, like, in the context of family relationships, or your workplace, or politics, right? How often are people talking about what people are doing wrong versus what they're doing right?
99%.
Yeah, it can often be a lot. And here what they're getting at is a couple of things. And actually, it just strikes me as I'm saying that, like, I mean, obviously that's true in many areas, but like, I'm struck by that. Actually, every now and then I do a little aside, but I'll do one now. I work as a psychologist, and oftentimes I'm really struck by that. Actually, like people who are doing, I can think of examples, teenagers who are doing, so many positive things, and like they'll say, well, nobody notices. I say, why do you think nobody notices? Well, nobody ever says, like, nobody points it out. Like, they just say, do more homework, or work harder on. And I realized, like, oh wow, like nobody praised them for being kind to their friend who was going through a hard time. Nobody noted, wow, that's great, you're being a genuine friend to somebody, or like, and the same thing, like in, there's good research on marriages, for example, right? And 50-50 is not good. Right? Like, if half the things the person's saying are negative and half are positive, that's a bad marriage. Is what the research suggests. There needs to be the ratio of positive to negative needs to be much more in balance in the positive direction, but oftentimes it's not. That's the point. And so, this is getting at a general point, which is not that, and what Lama Tsongkhapa here is, he's not saying that if somebody's genuinely doing something wrong, you can't point it out. That's not the point here. But the point is, when we see something positive, that we should, first of all, tell the person that. And then he's saying, and also tell other people that. Does that make sense? Like, just saying, I appreciate this. This is wonderful that that somebody's doing this, or that the person is choosing to live in that way. So that's actually a training. Does that make sense? It's actually like a practice.
Rejoicing.
Yes. So rejoicing is in first. So we have to rejoice in our own mind, and then this is saying, and then rejoice verbally too. Yeah. And that would include, right, to the person themselves and also to other people. Which, first of all, especially for somebody who's new at doing good things, it encourages them, right? Like, so if nobody's noticing, people sometimes stop doing it. And another thing, sometimes people do things to get attention, and there's like negative attention and positive attention. So this is giving positive attention to the positive action. Then Lama Tsongkhapa goes on, and he makes a couple different points about this. One is he quotes a bodhisattva, Sharawa, who was a Tibetan teacher, who said, and Sharawa made a point. He said, in your own spiritual practice, you may notice something. He said, some people will notice this, and it's not a positive. he says, where you're. Actually, I'll read the way he phrases it. He says, although we have been creating a little bit of something like virtue, which I think is a funny way of putting it, right? Is we getting at, like, we're starting out and we're sort of trying, and he says, but we seem to see no sign of its increase and many signs of its exhaustion. Right? So this is getting actually at a certain point. Sharawa was sort of advising. He's not being critical here. He's actually trying to help people, right? He's saying, if you yourself start to notice of yourself now, right? Well, I seem to be trying to do some kind of Dharma practice, but I'm not really getting anywhere, right? Or I seem to be trying to do some positive things, but it just seems like I'm treading water or maybe going slightly backwards. And then he says, check, right? Sharawa was saying, check up on yourself, right? Like, introspect. Maybe the reason is that you've been disrespectful to other people and not being, and especially bodhisattvas, that you've not been encouraging them and praising them, but instead have been critical of them. He said, and that may be undermining your own growth. That's what he's saying here. So he says, or feeling disdain for them or insulting them. So then he says, so if you find that you're doing that, abandon that practice. Abandon insulting them or putting them down. And then he makes another point, of course, which I'll explain now. He says, then he makes this point, actually Lama Tsongkhapa makes this point, then he says, in understanding Sharawa's comment, there's something important to consider, which is, we don't really know who's a bodhisattva, right? And so Sharawa is saying, if you're insulting people, that gets in the way of your spiritual practice, particularly if you're insulting bodhisattvas. Then Lama Tsongkhapa says, but remember, you don't know who's a bodhisattva. And so whoever you're insulting in your life, if there are people you're putting down, maybe they're bodhisattvas, right? And so then Lama Tsongkhapa is basically saying, so since you don't have that real ability to know somebody else's heart that well, best to treat everyone with respect and not to insult anybody, and then you don't have the danger of insulting bodhisattvas. Does that make sense? The logic behind what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying. And so then he makes a general point about so whenever you have the opportunity to praise the activity of bodhisattvas, in particular, to do that, and I would include that, since we don't know who's a bodhisattva, that whenever we see somebody doing something positive, to praise that, to encourage that. And what does that do, right? First of all, actually, just that simple act, I just want to make one last point about it, like just the simple act of praising somebody's positive effort, first of all, it may encourage them, right? If they're feeling insecure or discouraged or something, just hearing, I can think of people I've known like that. Like, do you think of that? Like, I'll just share that. A couple times, like, sometimes people will tell me a story, a few times, I can think of friends, who said, like, I was going through this really hard time, I was feeling very discouraged, and then suddenly somebody noticed. And I remember just the other day somebody was saying that to me. He said, I thought I was invisible, and then somebody saw me, and they said, wow, I see, like, in your heart you're really trying, or I see how much you're, and like, where the person said, I was giving up, and then that person pointed that out, and they have no idea. And they were saying to me, actually, the person said, the other person had no idea that affected me that way. But for me, it helped me not give up and keep going in what I was trying to do. So we don't know when we're that person. That's one point. Does that make sense? Just by praising the positive action, you don't know when you're the person who, who's a turning point for somebody else. That's one point. Second point is that other people hear that. Does that make sense? Or so, like, could be adults, could be children, right? But when other people hear you pointing out the positive, then they want to do, they may be encouraged to do more positive. And then the third point is, by praising somebody else, you're also getting in the habit of appreciating that for yourself, so that you'll become, because we also aren't always positive, but if we praise others' positive things, it also is sort of giving ourselves an implicit message of appreciation and joy in that, which makes us want to do more of that. So there are various levels in which that is a positive thing. And And then the fourth of these four, which again, you'll see the logic behind this one being, let's see if I say it right, a way to create the karma to continue having bodhicitta in future lives, is encouraging, basically it's encouraging others to practice bodhicitta. So in other words, when you have the opportunity to do that. And that could be, I'll make a point here. This one, I'll go into more detail in a second, but this one can be, sort of formally explaining bodhicitta somewhere or something. But this also includes, right, just in normal life, right? Like when somebody comes to you for advice, like, oh, I don't know what to do about my friend who insulted me, or I'm mad at my coworker or something, right? Like, at that moment we have the opportunity, does that make sense? Like to encourage bodhicitta in somebody else. It doesn't mean like saying to them, you should, let's assume for a moment the person is not Buddhist, so you don't use the word bodhicitta, and you're not saying to them, go be Buddhist, right? That's not the point. What it's saying is, you can encourage compassion, right? And forgiveness and kindness, those kind of positive qualities, or you can say, oh yeah, what a jerk they were, and then try to, whatever, and then sort of fan the flames of their hatred or something, or their disgust, or whatever it is. So we have this opportunity all the time, right, to encourage love or compassion in other people. And it's up to us, right? And I'll make one more point, right? This one is also getting at, like, we sometimes forget that, like, His Holiness the Dalai Lama often, and Lama Tsongkhapa both often point out that, like, we forget that our small actions have an impact, right? And His Holiness the Dalai Lama often had the quote, what was that? World peace begins with inner peace. Right? Whereas, and there's this idea that, whereas if the human world is made up of all of us, right? And so, so I think it's funny in a bit, right? Whereas if I myself am filled with disgust or disdain for other groups of people, and then I'm saying, and if I'm disgusted with them because they're not peaceful, like, it's a bit ridiculous, isn't it? Because I'm not peaceful either then, isn't that true? So what this is getting at, in a way, I'm just elaborating on the point here, is that if we ourselves are peaceful and then encourage compassion and loving kindness in others, that is our contribution to world peace. Does that make sense? On a literal level, actually, it's like we're another person who's actually doing that. And that has an impact, is the point. And sometimes I think we forget that has an impact. Makes sense? But, like, it does. There's just as, we know that. If you look at the examples of the opposite, it's clear, right? Like, there's one person encouraging hatred in those around them has a real impact, doesn't it? Because we know that. We can see many historical examples. There are just a few, there are many. But the opposite is also true. Does that make sense? So this is getting at a point there, that if we cultivate love and compassion ourselves and then encourage that in others, that has impacts that we don't know on other people. And we don't always get to see the long-term impacts of that, but they're there. So okay, go back to the text. Okay, so Lama Tsongkhapa says a couple points here. One is he says, he says, whether you're teaching Dharma formally, or somebody's coming to you for advice or support or like that, anything of that sort, the karma here is encouraging other people, when you have the opportunity to do so, to practice love, compassion, and bodhicitta. And then he makes a point. He says, if the other person doesn't develop compassion or bodhicitta, he said, that's not your responsibility. Whereas your responsibility is you do your best to embody that and to encourage that in the people around you. But of course, he's getting at a point here, which is, ultimately people have their own free will and responsibility. So this karma is not, this action doesn't mean you always succeed. Does that make sense? The idea is just that's a healthy way to be present in the world. And overall it has a positive impact. But of course, if you encourage compassion in somebody and then they say, no, I want to go get even, well, at that point, that's their responsibility. Does that make sense? That's their decision, and you have to accept that. But still, when they come back, a few weeks later, having said, I got even, now the person's attacking me back, then you can, again, try to encourage compassion. So that is, he's making a point there about, anyway, it's about boundaries, right? In other words, that you can't control others' feelings and actions, but you can control your own speech. And so, using your speech to encourage positive things in others. And then Lama Tsongkhapa makes one more point on this one, where he says, he also says here, he makes a point which he says, from our own side, as we're cultivating bodhicitta, what we want actually is for others to be happy. Right? Because that's the point, isn't it? And so a couple points there he's making. One is, so encouraging others to be loving and to be compassionate and to practice bodhicitta, both gives them happiness in the short run and in the long run. So that's another reason to do this. Does that make sense? That's one point. There is that encouraging others to be loving and compassionate is helping them to be happier, and that's our point. And then he says, this makes it clear. He says, that the point, I think he's implying this for a couple reasons. Sometimes when we encourage others to be compassionate or to be kind, they may come to regret their own negative. Actually, it's true, isn't it? Sometimes, if a person is if a person has been particularly self-centered, a person can feel upset in a way at recognizing that. And he's saying that's not our intention. Our intention is to bring about happiness for others. But again, if others, I think he's getting a point here about differentiating from other people. Or is that we are not ultimately responsible for others' feelings, right? We can encourage goodness in others, we can encourage positive in others, but ultimately other people will then do with that what they do. Does that make sense? And we can just encourage what's positive.
So Dr. Narn, wouldn't it be inappropriate to do something like that to somebody else if it generates feelings in them that are not virtuous?
You mean so if you encourage compassion and they become more angry?
The
or
other
something?
way.
It's an actually interesting point. And this is why, this is, it makes me think of, Lama Tsongkhapa often will point out, he'll say until and that's the reason for wanting to become enlightened actually, right, is that, in other words, Buddhas, part of the definition of being a Buddha is one is always skillful, and ultimately skillful in one's interactions with others, because one sees the causal connections that are there, and the karmic seeds, and the relational dynamics as fully as they can be known. But for ordinary people like us, we're going to make mistakes as part of the assumption behind this, I think, and what's implicit here. And I think what this is getting at in a way is, though, that we still have to try as best we can with whatever wisdom we have. And one thing Lama Tsongkhapa said, that was funny. One time, somebody was, I found this helpful to me personally. Somebody asked Lama Tsongkhapa this question. They said, when I try to practice compassion, I often make mistakes. And the effect is not what I intended. And on the one hand, there's a point we have to use as much wisdom as we have, but, so it's not just compassion, right? We have to use our wisdom as best we can in interacting with others. But then, the part that made me laugh, that was helpful to me, was from a Buddhist perspective. Lama Tsongkhapa was pointing out, he said, only a Buddha does that perfectly. So he's saying, a 10th bhumi, the last bhumi of Bodhisattva, still makes subtle mistakes, and then the 9th bhumi makes more than the 10th and the 8th. So he talked about very exalted beings who can emanate all kinds of bodies, and then he was saying and then first bhumi bodhisattvas compared to a 10th bhumi bodhisattva are much, much, much less capable of helping others. He said, but we're not. Then if you have to go through the 5 paths before, because the first bhumi bodhisattva is on the path of seeing, and he's saying somebody on the path of preparation is not as effective as them, but still can help others, and then somebody on the path of accumulation, which is the first path. And then he said, so if you get to a person at the early stage of the path of accumulation, they're much more helpful to helping, in terms of helping others, they're much more helpful than somebody who's not at that level, like us. And then he said, and that's like us. We're aspiring to get to that level. And he said, so we're going to be making mistakes for a long time then. So he said, so that's okay. But at each level, we have to do our best to be of service to others and encourage others. But he said, but of course we'll make mistakes. That's the point. And we're going to make mistakes for a long time to come. But if we don't do our best, we won't progress. It's part of the point.
So basically, you learn from your mistakes and you have more clarity next time.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the end of that section anyway, so other comments or questions before I go on to the next section on that, anything about those four? They're quite nice practices, right, or reminders. But, okay, so then, so now Lama Tsongkhapa was going on, actually about encouraging bodhicitta in others. And he says, okay, this next part actually, he quotes a sutra that's making the same point actually. He says, actually it's just an interesting quote though. It's from the sutra requested by the lion. But it says, by means of what is bodhicitta not given up in all one's lives, if not even in one's dreams, much less when one is not asleep. He spoke, meaning the Buddha, and said, in the cities and villages, in the countries where you live, guide others correctly to enlightenment. Through that, bodhicitta will not be abandoned. Actually, here, I'm just going to make a short point. Here, part of the implication in this verse is about karma, right? So what it's saying is, if you yourself want to practice bodhicitta throughout this life and in all your future lives, part of, like, how karma, like, in the teachings on karma, for example, around, let me use a simple example around stealing, right? Remember early on in the text when they were talking about the 10 non-virtuous actions, they were saying the karmic result of stealing is not having resources in a future life, right? Because you've stolen from others, you sort of create the cause for poverty. And then the opposite of that, right? That through generosity, Nagarjuna said that, right? The main karmic cause of wealth is generosity. So here what's being gotten at in a way is like, so what's the karmic cause of hearing about bodhicitta in future lives? It's explaining about bodhicitta to others, right? Encouraging others, and it could be, and actually, it doesn't have to just be, like I was giving examples, like whether it's formally teaching or encouraging somebody, but it'd be giving away, giving books to people, giving other, giving people information, offering that for free or whatever, giving away things like that, right? But it's by giving that to others that or helping organize teachings for somebody else, like if, there are lots of opportunities like that, right, where like a lama is coming to teach and if you volunteer to help out so that people can hear about topics like that, right? Those are all ways that you're helping make that available to others, right? And part of the implication here is karma, right? Is that what you make available to others is also what you receive as a natural side effect. Not that you're doing it mainly for that reason, but that's a natural result, and they're pointing that out. And then, another sutra, Lama Tsongkhapa quotes another sutra saying, he's just explaining more about how not to abandon bodhicitta, and he's saying additional things that help one not abandon bodhicitta. One is, and these are pretty straightforward, one is to give up pride, to give up jealousy, to give up miserliness, and to mentally, and to practice joy, practice rejoicing in when one sees others having good results. Does that make sense? And that one, actually, I'll just make a point, is like, it's actually, those are related, right? The jealousy and the not rejoicing. So part of the idea here is if we have love and compassion for others, if we're cultivating that, right, and then we find ourselves feeling jealous when others are having some kind of good experience, right, whether it's good friends or wealth is the example here, or good resources of some kind, and then we feel upset by that, it's to pause and recognize, oh, wait a second, I was cultivating compassion for that person, right? So that means I want them to have comfort or good things. And so it's like kind of reminding ourselves of that and then rejoicing that they have that and sort of wishing actually they had more up to enlightenment, right? Like, so it's actually a mental training to overcome jealousy in that case.
Yeah, actually, it looks like it's just the three ways of relating to others, the pattern that we always either look up, well,
Yeah.
and then because of that joyfulness.
That's true. Yeah, and I'll just make a side point about what you just said. actually, that's, you know, in some of the mind training texts, right, they really talk about that point, about how we tend to either, or like, there's a habit, a certain kind of mental habit where we're looking up, down, or neutral, like, as if we're even. And in one sense, when we it's a useful tool for mindfulness, isn't it? Because if you catch yourself doing that, right, because if you start feeling like, you know, with some people it's more the I'm up and you're down, right? Like, oh, like I'm so good,
Right.
I'm this poor person. With other people, it's more like, oh wow, look at that person who's up, you know. And when we catch ourselves doing that, to recognize, oh, we're off track, actually, isn't it? As soon as we're caught up in that kind of feeling, we're not viewing others as just simple human beings, right? Who are worthy of compassion, kindness, and respect, and so even the putting others up is a kind of
Low self-image.
yeah, low self-image, and it's sort of there's an implication there, right? Then wanting something from them,
Exactly.
which actually you can see that it's funny if you watch like a couple times, if you ever do that, if you watch if you watch somebody who's like because they're very wealthy or very famous or something, where they're in the position of being the one put up, you see like it's after a while it's like a torture, actually, almost. It's like a torment, right? To have to be the person who everybody's like looking at, like, you know, because the person actually feels like I can't just be myself, right? So it's actually, you know, we sometimes think we're being nice to them by looking up to them in that way. But actually I've noticed that, I'll just share that. One thing I've noticed over time, is sometimes people who are often in that position, I've noticed they find a lot of relief in being around someone like Khyentse Rinpoche or the Dalai Lama, or because they treat them like anybody else.
Right.
Say right, like, and there's some relief in that because it's actually quite stressful, right, to always be the person who somehow.
Then you have to pretend. It's a pretentious, ignorant life.
Yeah.
Most of the time.
Yeah, this is exhausting. And then, okay, now Lama Tsongkhapa makes another point, where he says, and actually this one's particularly important, I think. So he's quoting the Cloud of Jewels Sutra, but he makes this point, he says, you know, so really an essential training is to cultivate bodhicitta in all our activities, you know, and that's probably the most important of all these in some way. And he says, you know, and so before you do anything, you know, cultivate bodhicitta. And so the idea here, like Lama Tsongkhapa was calling this what Mahayana mindfulness, right? So it's different than you know, just being mindful of our actions, but actually being mindful of our actions while imbuing them with a sense of love, compassion, and bodhicitta. And I'll make a general point about this one. Like, part of the idea is that you know, when somebody's realized bodhicitta, so if somebody's like a bodhisattva, right, then that happens automatically. Whereas a bodhisattva, the part of the definition of somebody who's realized bodhicitta, and it's a fully fledged bodhisattva or something, is that, you know, first thing when they wake up in the morning, like that's their normal, immediate, like, you know, like, so somebody might, like, somebody might wake up and think, oh, I want my cup of coffee, right, or something. Somebody else might wake up and think, like, oh, I don't want to go to work today, or something, or you know, how's the traffic going to be? Let me check my app or something, or whatever that would be, you know. But bodhisattvas, when they wake up, their first thought is compassion. And then, like, the idea behind, like, their baseline, right? Like, so ordinarily our baseline is like, how is my day going to be, right? Whereas a bodhisattva's baseline way of relating to the world is, how can I be of service, right? How can I embody love and compassion for others, or how can I practice the path to enlightenment for the sake of others? But if we're not at that point yet, that's fine. Like, in other words, but the idea is, how does one get to that point? And so there's this, Khyentse Rinpoche sometimes uses this word, contrive. Like, we have to, like, that's spontaneous bodhicitta. Does that make sense? It's just utterly spontaneous, even in their dreams, right? Bodhisattvas, even in their dreams are about love and compassion and bodhicitta and service to others and practicing the path. But if we're not at that level, then we have, Khyentse Rinpoche says, at the beginning we have to contrive bodhicitta. So what he's saying there is this practice, right? So what we have to do is, like, because we're not yet spontaneous at it, is we have to contemplate, right, intentionally. Like, thinking about the suffering of others, thinking about how others want happiness and don't want suffering. Thinking about all sentient beings as having been one's mother in past lives, going through the 7-point, that's that one method. Or the other one, equalizing and exchanging self for others. Thinking about the faults of self-cherishing, the advantages of love and compassion, and so on. But so if one does that over and over again, one continually contrives bodhicitta, and then eventually bodhicitta becomes spontaneous. That's the way it becomes natural. And I just want to point this out, like, this is how anything works with the mind. In other words, Shantideva says, the mind can become habituated to anything. And, you know, if you think, like, how do I say this right? Like, you know, I'll make a point about that. Like, for somebody who's not, I'm using an analogy here. For somebody who's not anxious, not naturally an anxious person, right? Like, you know, if people, like, say to them over and over again, oh, this could go wrong, that could go wrong, this bad thing could happen. You know, eventually, of course, the person who's not anxious will get a little bit of anxiety, right? It's like, oh, wow, maybe they're right. Maybe something will happen. Whereas somebody who's been very skillful in cultivating anxiety, it's ironic, right? They wake up. I was worried. They wake up in a state of extreme anxiety, right? And when they're going to sleep, they can't fall asleep because they're extreme. So that mind, and again, it's not to criticize them, but I'm just pointing out that mind is habituated to anxiety. Does that make sense? Or somebody who's angry. Use that example, right? Like if somebody's really angry at somebody else, right? Like where you're like, what's it called? Enraged or something like that, right? Then like as you're going to sleep, you're thinking, and then even in your dreams, you're agitated, and then you wake up, right? And as soon as you wake up, you think, oh, that person, I have to see them today, or something like that. If it's a coworker or whatever, right? Like, or it's your partner, maybe, you know, like, where it's like always there in the person's mind. Does that make sense? And so here we're trying to cultivate that intentionally. Like, I guess my point is that those negative minds, like, can imbue our whole day because we get habituated to them. Does that make sense? Our mind is habituated to them, so they start to infuse our entire day. Here we're trying to learn how to habituate ourselves to bodhicitta by intentionally cultivating it over and over again, and eventually it becomes spontaneous like that. Does that make sense? So I guess what I'm saying in a way, ironically, is if ordinary people can infuse their minds with anger or hatred or anxiety or fear or whatever, then that's the proof the mind can be imbued with something. Does that make sense? So here we're trying to imbue it intentionally, though, with love and with compassion and with bodhicitta until that becomes our baseline, our way of being all the time, even as we wake up, even as we eat, as we, you know, like that. So one is cultivating it, and if we do that in a contrived way repeatedly, eventually it will become our natural state. Okay, and then I'll cover this just briefly. Lama Tsongkhapa makes another point here next, where he says, actually the one part, so if one has taken the aspiring bodhisattva vow, right, then that's where, and it was covered in the text, but that's where one goes to a teacher or in front of a statue, and you can do it, and you take this vow of aspiring to practice bodhicitta at all times. It's not yet the engaged vow with where there are actual specific lists of behaviors that one vows to. But he says, if you've taken that aspiring vow, then he says two things. He says, one is, if you then just give up bodhicitta and say, never mind, I don't want to do that, you've broken that vow. You vowed to practice compassion, and then you're saying, I'm no longer going to practice bodhicitta. And the second one is, he says, if you give up on even one sentient being completely. So that's different, right? In other words, you can be upset with somebody or something like that, but if you say, I have no compassion for this person ever, and I want to lead all other beings to enlightenment someday if I become enlightened, but not them, then you've broken that bodhisattva vow. You've given it up. And then he says, the other vows that are taught on the engaged bodhicitta, there is a list of 18 root vows, they call them. Those are two of them. If you broke that, he's saying those two are in common, basically. If you break that one, you've even broken the aspiring. The other 16, he's saying, if you break those, you haven't broken this vow because you didn't promise to keep those. He says it's still you've lost an opportunity to do something good. There's still a negative action, but it's not a broken vow. He's differentiating that because in other words, if you those are there's like a term in Buddhism for like naturally prescribed and vowed behavior. So there are certain things that are naturally negative, and there are other things where they're only negative because you promise not to do them. Does that make sense? Like, so an example would be, I'll give an example of this, like not helping somebody who's, like failing to help someone who's ill, right? first of all, helping somebody who's ill is a good thing to do, but failing to do that is not in and of itself, like if you didn't promise to do it, right, then it's not, you're not breaking some kind of vow, and it's not, you didn't have a particular, let's just say, that's not intrinsically a bad thing. If you said, I was too busy, I didn't have time to do that, it's not compassionate, it may not be the compassionate thing to do, but it's not intrinsically a negative karma. But if you promise to do it and then you fail to do it, that is a negative karma. So he's like making that kind of differentiation. Okay, so now Lama Tsongkhapa enters into another, so that's the end of that section. And now Lama Tsongkhapa starts another section. And before getting into this, I mean, as a kind of introduction to this section, I want to make a comment about it, which is, one, most of this text, are actual, like, practices. But every now and then Lama Tsongkhapa will do what he's about to do here, which is explaining about a practice, but particularly, I've noticed this about Lama Tsongkhapa's writing style, and it's only Dalai Lama pointed this out, actually, a number of times, is that one thing that Lama Tsongkhapa particularly does is he, like, I say this right, like, the way the Dalai Lama said it is, other Tibetan authors, he made this point actually, he said, there are Tibetan authors who have written more books than Lama Tsongkhapa. He's not the most prolific of all the writers in Tibetan history, he's quite prolific. And he hasn't written on the widest range of topics. In other words, there are other Buddhist authors in Tibetan history who have written on a wider range of topics than Lama Tsongkhapa, although he wrote on many topics, not every topic. And what it only says is, though, what Lama Tsongkhapa is, one of his unique qualities, though, as an author, is where people can misunderstand something, or where something's difficult to understand. We'll see that especially in the later section on emptiness. Lama Tsongkhapa goes to the most difficult points, or the points that have been most misunderstood, and he addresses them directly and strongly and clearly. And he says that's one of Lama Tsongkhapa's unique qualities as an author, is that he addresses potential misunderstandings and difficult points of teaching. And he'll often take an aside to do that because he doesn't want people to misunderstand, and especially if he recognizes that throughout Buddhist history people have misunderstood a point, then he goes straight towards that. Does that make sense? Where other authors may gloss over that or not cover it in depth, he particularly goes towards any point that is likely to be misunderstood or has been misunderstood repeatedly. And that is it. He's always pointed that out, and the more I've read Lama Tsongkhapa, oh, it's true, it does. Like, at any topic, whatever topic he's teaching on, and again, emptiness particularly, but tantric topics and these topics, he'll sort of, whatever people tend to misunderstand, he's
direct.
He's direct about it and argues it clearly.
Logics are like pretty well formed.
Yeah.
I don't think he quotes too much of scripture, but he has his own thoughts, and it's direct.
He does both. Here you'll see he does both in this section.
Lamrim he has done a lot. But some of the books that I've read, Robert Thurman's on emptiness, and it's very direct, especially on emptiness.
Yeah, on emptiness he's really direct about points that, again, they've been misunderstood throughout Buddhist history. And so here he's doing a version of that, about a particular topic, which he'll get into a lot of detail on in a few pages just. But what he's getting at here is, he starts off by pointing out something, which is, first of all, he says, having cultivated bodhicitta, he makes this point, he says, that's very good. Or is it bodhicitta, compassion is the very root of the whole path to enlightenment. Right? And bodhicitta is the ultimate expression of compassion. So bodhicitta is a wonderful state of mind, in some ways the most wonderful state of mind one can possibly cultivate, because it includes love for all beings, compassion for all beings, even the sense of responsibility for the welfare of all beings, and then this active wish to become enlightened, to be of ultimate benefit for all beings. So it's really something quite wonderful. And Lama Tsongkhapa's point, just having cultivated that brings humongous spiritual benefits, just having cultivated that mind. And then now he's going to start addressing some issues. And one is he makes the point, then he says, but you should understand something, that mind in and of itself is not enough to bring about Buddhahood, or his enlightenment, full enlightenment, because one has to conjoin that mind of bodhicitta with the actual trainings of a bodhisattva. And so just cultivating bodhicitta in and of itself is a necessary but not sufficient cause for becoming a Buddha. So one has to train, and he says, if you don't engage in the bodhisattva trainings as an essential practice, it's impossible to become a Buddha. Therefore, you should engage in those trainings. And then he goes on, and this he quotes Kamalashila, who was an Indian teacher who came to Tibet, who's going to be mentioned numerous times in this section. And Kamalashila says something, which I'll read this quote, and it's important. He says, a bodhisattva who has generated bodhicitta understands, and this is the key here, that he or she cannot tame others without taming themselves, him or herself, and thoroughly applies, therefore, him or herself, to the practice of generosity and so forth. Without them, one cannot achieve enlightenment. So this actually is a very brief quote, but it's quite profound, right? So one point he's making, right, is, Kamalashila is making there is, very interesting. You can't tame others unless you've tamed yourself, right? You can't help others, like, there are various ways to say that. You can't give somebody else something you don't have, right? If we ourselves haven't practiced patience, we can't really teach somebody else patience, right? If we ourselves haven't learned compassion, we can't really teach compassion to others. If we ourselves haven't achieved enlightenment, then we can't lead others to enlightenment. Does that make sense? And so he's saying, if you really want to help others, you have to begin by working on yourself. That's a quite profound point, isn't it? I mean, just pausing on that. I mean, oftentimes, sometimes I think there are times where sometimes one can want to distract oneself from one's own, the hard work of one's own mind by saying, I'm too busy helping other people, right? I'm going to go do something, like I'm going to be of service. And what Kamalashila is saying is, the implication here is don't go be of service, but you can't avoid that inner work. Does that make sense? If you try to avoid that inner work, your capacity to help others won't grow, will be impaired. And ultimately, if you don't achieve enlightenment, you won't be of ultimate effect to others. So therefore, the implication is, as he says, the practice of generosity and so forth. So there, what Kamalashila is getting at are the 6 perfections. Generosity, ethics, patience, joyful effort, meditative concentration, and wisdom. And he's saying, without those, you won't achieve enlightenment, and therefore your ability to be of service to others will always have impairment. And so Lama Tsongkhapa says, so once we've taken the bodhisattva vow, we should engage in the trainings associated with those trainings of the bodhisattva to progress along the path to enlightenment. And then he goes on, Lama Tsongkhapa goes on, continuing to quote Kamalashila. And so next he says, he makes a point. He's making 2 points here. He's saying one is, once you've cultivated compassion and bodhicitta, and you want to become enlightened, right? Part of bodhicitta is the wish to become enlightened. He makes 2 points. He says you can't practice. First, Kamalashila says you can't practice a mistaken path. And Kamalashila gives an analogy. He gives an analogy for each. So his analogy for a mistaken path is he says if a person wants milk, and they go to a bull and pull on the bull's horn, they're not going to get any milk, right? Which is a pretty earthy analogy. And he's saying, like, they got far enough to know it's the right kind of animal, but they misunderstood the method for gaining milk. And so he's saying there, we need to be, again, this is Lama Tsongkhapa starting to say, we need to be precise in our understanding of the methodology of what's the path to enlightenment. And then he says, also, it's not sufficient to practice an incomplete path. And there, Kamalashila uses a different metaphor. His metaphor there is, if you want to grow a crop, right, that you need to have seed, water, earth, and warmth, and so on. And even one missing ingredient, and the crop won't grow, right? which is quite true again, isn't it? Like, and so he's saying, you know, we need to bring together all the causes of a result in order to have that result, right? Because one of the, this analogy of the seed is getting at a point, which is, Buddhism, you know, Lama sometimes says, if you were going to have like one slogan for Buddhism, if you're going to make up one slogan to embody all the Buddhist teachings, it would be dependent origination. Right? That things arise in dependence upon other things, and things are interdependent, and things arise based on causes and conditions, not causelessly. And so that includes enlightenment. Right? That enlightenment itself has to have causes and conditions, or it won't come about. And so this analogy of the seed is an important one. So one has to bring together all the causes. And what they sometimes say is, if you bring together all the causes of enlightenment, then even if you didn't want to become enlightened, you become enlightened. If you don't bring together all the causes, no matter how much you want, or a certain result, whatever that result is, it won't happen because of dependent origination, interdependence. And then he quotes a text, which is, and this is quite beautiful. It says, somebody asked a question about enlightenment, and it's, I'll read the quote. "O Lord of secrets, the exalted wisdom of omniscience," which means enlightenment, Buddhahood itself, "arises from the root that is compassion. It arises from the cause that is the mind of enlightenment, and is culminated by method." So what he's getting at there, and it's quite important to understand these steps, right? Compassion is the very beginning point, right? Compassion is the very root of the path to enlightenment. But then that gives rise to bodhicitta, right? As he says here, the mind of enlightenment, meaning bodhicitta. And then combining that bodhicitta with the 6 perfections, meaning method, one becomes a Buddha. And the commentary is another point given here, which is when it says the bodhicitta, there's also, and Lama Tsongkhapa I think says that here, yeah, he says it in the next paragraph. So the word bodhicitta, there's also, sometimes it's differentiated, he does it here, into conventional bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta. And one needs both. So conventional bodhicitta is a mind, you know, based on love and compassion that aspires to achieve enlightenment for the welfare of others. So that's a method. That's what they call part of the method aspect of the path. Ultimate bodhicitta refers to, under the influence of that compassionate mind, realizing emptiness, which is wisdom. And so, in this sense, he's also pointing out one needs a combination of method and wisdom. That it's not enough. You know, the method side of the path is not sufficient on its own, and also the wisdom side of the path is not sufficient on its own. That one has to combine the method aspects of the path, which include compassion, generosity, patience, and so on, with wisdom, particularly the wisdom to understand the ultimate nature of things.
Dr. Aaron, it just made me think, like, it's kind of a gray area whenever we say method and wisdom, because it's like, it goes side by side. Everything is like, even for 6 perfections, the less of self means more of greater intensity of any of those 6 perfections. Less and less self, more and more wisdom via method. So it's like, I almost tend to think like, it's like conjoined together, the whole concept about the union when we say method and when we say the wisdom. The wisdom comes when you have made your mistakes, I guess, in some way, or have practiced some of your method. And then the wisdom came in, sometimes by making mistakes, sometimes striving hard for it, contrite way of doing things. Well, I almost have an opinion that it goes side by side all the time.
In one sense, first of all, you're right, they should go side by side, and that's the goal. But remember also, that particularly when they talk about ultimate bodhicitta here, that there's an important distinction to make, like, so on a practical level, especially for us as beginners, I think you have a very good point. But part of what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at here, when he says ultimate bodhicitta, that kind of wisdom, and then conventional bodhicitta, which he's gonna explain more about in the text, is that the ultimate, like, particularly wisdom in this context, the ultimate, on the ultimate path form of that, and Sutrayana here is what he's getting at, is a mind that directly realizes emptiness. So that mind only arises in a deep meditative concentration. And so one point he would make in terms of the causes of enlightenment, is that one has to have that experience of at a certain point on the path of a kind of a deep meditative concentration that directly realizes emptiness, in which there are no other appearances other than emptiness to that mind at that time. So at that time, and they sometimes say that mind in a way is influenced by, still that mind is sort of influenced by the method of bodhicitta, for example, because it was there right before it, and so it sort of propelled it into that. But subjectively, for that person in that experience, there's only the only appearances of emptiness itself. There's no other, because that mind is non-conceptual at that time. And then when one arises from that, one practices, and again, but that was influenced by bodhicitta. And then when one arises from that non-conceptual meditative state, again, one has conceptual minds, for example, of compassion, and they're influenced by that wisdom. But one isn't experiencing the direct realization of that wisdom at that second later time, when one is sort of practicing generosity, for example. When one practices generosity, that person would be practicing generosity influenced by that wisdom, and with a conceptual understanding of that wisdom, but they're no longer in the direct realization of it. So there's a kind of
so it's like getting to the peak.
Yeah,
Sort of.
they're getting closer and closer together, but they're not simultaneous in that sense. That kind of wisdom, at least. One still is influenced by wisdom and remembers the emptiness of the three spheres, for example, the giver, the gift, and the recipient, and so on. But it's not a direct realization at that time. So there is a kind of distinction. So.
If I'm understanding, as it's explained, how would you get to that kind of wisdom without the methods?
Right.
It sounds like let's go back to what he said. He said they go together because your goal is here, and you really can't get there without the methods.
Yeah.
So whether it's a peak or a path or a map,
Whichever method, yeah.
whatever the analogy is that we all use, or different ones use. So there really isn't a description, at least in these teachings, that there's another way to get to wisdom.
Hmm.
So they have to go together.
Yeah.
But you can't get there without.
That's true, although I guess again, I'm just trying to I agree in general, but one fine distinction you can make is that there still needs to be methods, so you're still right. But again, something Lama Tsongkhapa will get at in this section, in a way, is that people who practice the lesser vehicle, so somebody who's practicing the path to become an arhat or a solitary realizer, those beings don't practice the method of bodhicitta, and they don't practice the bodhisattva trainings. And they do realize that non-conceptual wisdom, understanding emptiness. Now, where you're right, though, is they still have to practice some kind of method, right? They have to practice ethics, and so on. They have to practice meditative concentration. They have to contemplate the meaning of emptiness, they have to study and contemplate the meaning of emptiness. So those practitioners who are not practicing the Mahayana, in one sense, you're right, because they still practice methods, including, for example, morality.
There's different methods.
But it's different methods that don't include bodhicitta. And so, in that sense, they're not practicing this method, but they are practicing method, yeah.
That
So
will be laid out by somebody else, and so the arhat to actually move to that stage eventually, there's another method path that's different than this one, but actually probably has a lot of very similarities under the grade of Buddhism.
Yeah, and the Buddha taught that method too, right? I mean, yeah, exactly. And he taught it for people who didn't have the disposition to want to practice that compassion at this level, and so he taught it. He taught sort of like a method that was sort of easier for a practitioner of that type. Yeah. So there's still a method, but it's a different method at that point. That doesn't include the vast method of bodhicitta. Yeah. Okay. So now Lama Tsongkhapa goes again at he's getting at a deeper misunderstanding that happens. And this one, he brings up a historical example, But this misunderstanding still exists, for sure, in Buddhist. If you go to, there's in Buddhist texts and in Buddhist talks or something like that, and Lama Tsongkhapa, as is typical of him, goes directly towards that issue. And he brings up a historical example, and remember he's been quoting Kamala Shiva, right, recently. So he brings up an example, and I'll read the first sentence. He says, one such mistaken conception regarding the path is upheld by the Chinese Hashang and others who say, quote, and I'll actually read the quote, as long as there are discursive thoughts, no need to talk about if they are bad conceptions, but even if they are good conceptions, they bind us in cyclic existence. He goes on from there. So he's bringing up a common misunderstanding, and he's using an historical example here. The historical example comes from the very early on in the transmission of Buddhism to Tibet. There came this historical point. You have to understand that to understand what he's getting at here. There came a point in history there was a Tibetan king, Trisong Detsen, actually who was the king who invited, who really brought Buddhism to Tibet, mainly. What's that?
He invited a decent.
Yeah, he invited, he was earlier than that. He invited Padmasambhava and also Shantarakshita to Tibet. So he invited Shantarakshita, who was a great scholar from Nalanda University, who started he was the first person to ordain monks and nuns in Tibet. I think nuns too. I'm not sure it was him or somebody else who ordained the nuns, honestly, but he brought monasticism to Tibet and the scholarly traditions of Nalanda. And then he also invited the Guru Padmasambhava, who transmitted the tantric teachings initially in Tibet, and famously.
Actually, he was from Nepal. That's what the history says.
Oh well, actually, I mean, he was living in it, but he was actually from. They say he's from what's it called? Some people say he was from Pakistan. That area that's now Pakistan.
I mean, those times.
Udiana, they call it, but I don't. Some historians say that's an area that's now part.
There's a lot of Nepalese literature about. Even in Kathmandu, you see a lot of references to Padmasambhava.
And he certainly lived in
Nepal. He might have
Nepal.
traveled that path going up the mountain.
They say he lived in Nepal for sure. There are caves in Nepal that he supposedly did retreat in.
Yeah.
I know some people have visited some of the caves of Padmasambhava.
Right.
I never did, but.
Up in the mountains.
Yeah, in the mountain. So I think he came that way.
Right.
But so during that time period, there was this early transmission of Buddhism to Tibet, and so Tibet was bringing Buddhism from the south, but it was also Buddhism already in China, right? So Chinese teachers were also coming to Tibet, and Hashang was one of the Chinese teachers who was there, and so there came a point, and this is both a historical reality, but it's also kind of almost symbolic of a common issue in Buddhism or something. Shantarakshita, and he had a student, and actually Shantarakshita's student was Kamala Shiva. So at a certain point, Shantarakshita advised that king, you should invite my student. Actually, correct.
I got it.
Oh, no, just a paper towel or something. This is built over all this. Thanks so much. I wanted to ruin the book. Thanks so much. I'll throw it out. But okay, so, sorry about distraction. Okay, so Shantarakshita, who had been invited by this king, later the king, he advised that king to also invite Kamala Shiva. And so what happened was, there came this point where the Buddhist teachers from India were suggesting what Lama Tsongkhapa has been suggesting, which is that one has to practice a path that combines method and wisdom, right? And that includes all kinds of positive conceptual minds, like compassion, right? And whereas compassion involved concepts. Oh, this person's suffering. Wow, what's the nature of their suffering? What's the cause of their suffering? How can I help alleviate their suffering? And so on. The Chinese teacher Hashang was presenting a different idea. His idea was all concepts are bad. And so one should empty one's mind of all concepts, and that's the path to enlightenment. So essentially, it's like a no thought, don't think. And actually, this is not, like, let's just say it right. Again, if you, actually, whether you look at, if you search around enough, you'll find current Buddhist books that say the same thing. You'll find, like, even cartoons that suggest that, right? Like, or little slogans that say that, like, you know, just as if the path to enlightenment is empty your mind, right? So that was kind of Hashang's view. And so here, now we can understand. So he's quoting Hashang, an actual quote from this Chinese teacher, his view was, and he gives these analogies here. So one is, you know, he says if you're tied up in a fetter, right? If your hands are tied and feet are tied, it doesn't matter if the cords tying them are rope or a gold, you're still tied, right? So he's saying, so even good. So he's using this analogy to say, even loving kindness, for example, in his view, is like a golden fetter that keeps you tied in samsara. It's bad. Then he gives another analogy. He says, or it's like it's like dark clouds and white cloud, you know, like white fluffy clouds or dark rain clouds. He says they both obscure the sun, so white clouds are bad also. Don't have any thoughts. You know, white clouds are like thoughts of patience or of morality, for example. So, and he gives one more analogy. What is it? The fetters, the clouds. Oh, and then he says, or what is his third analogy is of snake. He said, if a person's bitten by a white snake or a black snake, it's still being bitten. It's still a bad experience. So what his point was, right, I'll use the snake analogy, right? From his perspective, a black snake would be hatred, right, or jealousy or something like that, and the white snake would be loving kindness and patience and morality. His view was, they're all conceptual, they're all bad, just don't think, essentially. Like, clear your mind of all those and rest your mind in a state of non-thought.
So basically he said there's no method needed, just
Exactly.
wipe your mind.
Yeah, just clear your mind of all thought. That was his view. And then he says, that is why equipoise meaning meditative concentration without concepts about anything, is the path to Buddhahood. And his view was generosity, ethics, and so forth were taught just for the sake of foolish beings incapable of meditating on this definitive meaning. Therefore, you know, once you find this definitive meaning of this sort of non-thought, right, equipoise without concentration, and he gives an analogy, Hashang. He says it would be like somebody who's already achieved the status of a king, you know, going and acting like a commoner or something. So he's saying, like, that's so exalted and ordinary. Anything conceptual is lower. And so, again, you just pause for a moment, right? Like, you know, the relevance of this, you know, is this historical event happened, you know, like 800 AD or something like that. I can't remember the exact year, around there. That Hashang was explaining that, you know, why is that relevant today? Because people still uphold, and this is what Lama Tsongkhapa was noting, was in his time and throughout Buddhist history, other people have upheld the view that Hashang was upholding. And so Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, so I'll address it. And what happened historically, just briefly as an aside, is the king of Tibet, Trisong Detsen, organized a debate, as was typical in Buddhist history. In ancient India, and then actually Nepal and Tibet, the Buddhist tradition was you don't have a war, you debate. You know, you don't kill each other, you debate them. And the king made a rule. He said, whoever wins the debate, the other person has to follow our kingdom, and the person and the follower of that tradition has to follow the other tradition. They won. It's more logical, it's more reasonable. As Buddhists, we follow the path of reason.
Actually,
And so,
I read that they used to take the scripture of whoever lost it, tie it around the dog's tail, and the dog would, like, you know,
run
the
away,
street
yeah.
dogs go around.
If there was a wrong bit.
Yeah.
And so they had this debate, and the king had said, whoever wins the debate, Tibet will follow that approach. And of course, Kamalashila won the debate, but they say that Hashang refused to follow, he refused to, even though he had said beforehand he would follow whoever, you know, they both said he would follow the teaching of the winner of the debate. He refused and he ran away. He ran back he escaped, or he left Tibet and went back to China. But Tibet then became, you know, the the Tibetan kingdom at that point, followed the approach of Kamalashila. But actually, one commentator on this said when Hashang was running away, one of his shoes fell off, which I thought was funny. This is Tibetan Lama said this, and he said, and that symbolized that although for the most part Tibet would follow, like he left, so for the most part Tibet would follow the approach of Kamalashila, the left behind shoe symbolized that it would never, that view would never fully be rid of, Tibet would never fully be rid of that view, that wrong understanding, or wrong approach. It would still be there as part of the culture. And again, if you look around now, it's still part of how people view Buddhism. So Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, is that what he's getting at, if we go through this section, which we'll probably won't cover the whole thing, we'll cover a little more. What Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is like, if you follow that, he's starting to get at a point, which is if you follow that approach, you won't become enlightened. So it's quite important, and you won't even really be practicing the correct. You actually get many points. You'll harm yourself and you'll harm others. Before I get into that part, I'll just make one more point here. As long as the Dalai Lama has a commentary to this section. And he makes 2 points I just wanted to share. One is he says that we have to differentiate a couple things. Like we have to differentiate something to understand what Lama Tsongkhapa was getting at, which is, as I was describing when I was a couple minutes ago, what I was saying is, in the context of the combined practice of method and wisdom, there are meditative experiences that a bodhisattva has of a non-conceptual direct realization of emptiness, right? But that's very different. First of all, that is integrated with method. That's one point, right? The method aspects of that. And secondly, that's not a blanking out of the mind. That's not a rejecting of conceptuality. What that is, and there's an object to that. So the view of Hashang is you just empty your mind of thoughts. Does that make sense? And you kind of rest in a non-conceptual state. That's different from the direct realization of emptiness. There's one differentiation between them. Direct realization of emptiness comes from a reasoning process, where one reasons about the ultimate nature of reality and gains a conceptual understanding of it, and then by meditating deeply on that conceptual understanding of it, has a direct realization of that. And that's not the same as just rejecting thoughts or resting in a non-conceptual state. And then this one makes one more point, which I'll just mention. I don't think mainly for the recording, because some people may listen in practice this. Is Holy Slava makes another point about Dzogchen. He says some people misunderstand Dzogchen as thinking that's just Hashang's view, and there's only Dalai Lama, who's a teacher of Dzogchen, says that's also incorrect. And he makes this point. He says that even texts in the Dzogchen tradition say it is not sufficient just to rest in non-conceptuality, that one has to meditate, and the way he phrased it is meditate nakedly, internally nakedly, not externally, nakedly on the ultimate nature of the mind itself. Does that make sense? So there is that one is meditating on the sort of bare essence of the nature of mind, not just resting in a non-conceptual state. And so someone is saying, don't mistake this so he's saying, don't mistake this view of Hashang for emptiness. It's not. That's not correct. And don't mistake it for the view of Dzogchen, because it's not that either. So I'm just saying that because someone just mentioned it, and I thought it was helpful for people who are interested in those topics. Okay, now, what is Lama Tsongkhapa saying? So he says here, Hashang's statement that all factors of method are not a genuine path to Buddhahood is an enormous deprecation. And by refuting engagement in the essence of the victor's teachings, selflessness, the wisdom of individual investigation, it abandons the mode of the highest meaning, erring far away from it. So what he's saying here is 2 points, actually. He's beginning his refutation of this approach, right? Which again, isn't just about Hashang, but it's about, if somebody presents this to you, you have to check for yourself. So part of the reason I want to cover this is like, whereas if you hear somebody suggest that that's the approach to Buddhism, it's not sufficient to just say, well, Lama Tsongkhapa says that's wrong. He's saying, it's like, think about it. Here's the reason. He's going to present his reasonings so that you can, for yourself, say, what's my view of what the Buddha taught? Does that make sense? So the first point he's making is he's saying, if you look at the very nature of Buddhism, right? So the first one, the deprecation point, he uses this word deprecation. Deprecation means devaluing something that has value, right? Whereas if like, it'd be like this, if I say that chair is good for sitting on, and you say, no, I can't, like, you're not supposed to sit on chairs, you know, like, or that chair is incapable of being sat upon, like, you're deprecating the value of the chair, right? In other words, it's realistically something you can sit on. Whereas if I said, you know, if I said this tissue, I'm gonna float it in the air and you can sit on it, that wouldn't be deprecation, it doesn't work, right? So here, he's saying, it's an enormous deprecation. So what he's saying here is this, is if you understand the essence of what the Buddha taught, right, what is the path to Buddhahood? And he's already been talking about it. Ultimately, right, the very seed is compassion. Compassion is a conceptual mind, right? It has concepts. That's a person. They're suffering. How are they suffering? You know, and so on, right? And so he's saying, if you say that's not part of the path to enlightenment, you're deprecating. In other words, you're devaluing compassion, right? And then love, right? Love is a mind, again, which wishes others to be happy, right? That's a conceptual mind. And if you somehow think that mind has nothing to do with the path to enlightenment, whereas the very essence of enlightenment is love and compassion, so it doesn't make any sense. It's an illogical position to take. Another point I'll make is ethics, right? Morality. In other words, the idea that there's a path to enlightenment where moral behavior is not an essential part of that is a humongous deprecation and leads to all kinds of horrible things in the world, right? And for many religions, including Buddhism, right? Whereas when there are spiritual teachers who deprecate the value of morality, they harm their students, they don't help them, right? And some, you know, that happens in the world, right? Whereas, and again, Buddhism is included, right? Where there are people who misunderstand this point. Actually, it's very true, right? There are Buddhist teachers actually, you know, throughout history and now, right? Who hold this kind of view of deprecating the value of morality and then mistreat their students and, you know, do all kinds of things like that. And so, why do they do that? Partly because they have a misunderstanding. They sometimes will say, oh, I'm beyond morality because I'm resting in some non-conceptual state or something. And he's saying, that's a humongous deprecation that harms themselves and harms others, right, is what he's implying here. Then he's making another point. That's the first point, right, that they're deprecating all those aspects of the path, that there is no path to enlightenment without compassion, love, morality, patience, and so on. Then he's making a second point, which is, he's saying, the meaning of emptiness, as we were just starting to, as I just said, Don Lama pointed out, is not just some non-conceptual, some mind that's sort of blanked out from conceptuality. The meaning of emptiness is it comes about, he says, through individual investigation. Right? What he's saying there is, to understand the ultimate nature of reality, you have to investigate it yourself, right? You have to engage in an investigation. What is the nature of myself? What is the nature of objects? And that only can be done conceptually, at the beginning, right? We have to conceptually analyze and investigate, you know, in what way do I exist? And do I see myself as existing? The way in which I see myself as existing, is that actually how I exist or not, right? And when he says individual investigation, it means you yourself, if you want to cultivate wisdom, have to engage in such an analysis and come to some kind of realization about that, or recognition about that. And then through meditating on that, you can realize selflessness or emptiness. And he's saying, but this person the person who holds a view of just empty your mind of concepts is also deprecating that, right? In other words, if they may say, oh, I'm practicing just wisdom, but he's saying that's not wisdom, actually. Does that make sense? Wisdom comes about through a path of reasoning and individual investigation that then comes to a conclusion and then can become non-conceptual. But if somebody just jumps to non-conceptuality without that investigation, they're also disregarding or throwing out the actual wisdom teachings of the Buddha. That's Lama Tsongkhapa's argument. And he says, such a view is erring and is actually quite far away from the view of emptiness. And then he makes a point that Kamala Shila, Lama Tsongkhapa says, and Kamala Shila has refuted this wrong understanding, and now he's going to go on to refute it further. So then he says, he's going further into those same points. Where one is he's saying, still, even though Kamala, so what he's saying here is actually this, even though Kamala Shila refuted that view, he says, he was probably in Tibet, but it's still true in the West too. There are still those who scorn the side of conduct, such as guarding and restraining, right? So that's what I was just saying. There are still people who somehow think that they're, and actually it's an important point, I just want to say that here, like, according to the Buddha, right, and this is Lama Tsongkhapa presenting his perspective on the teachings of the Buddha, which is the same perspective that the Dalai Lama upholds, right? There is nobody who's beyond ethics. It's an important point. From the Buddha's point of view, the Buddha was not beyond ethics. Does that make sense? Like, the Buddha didn't say, oh, there comes a point where ethics are no longer relevant. And so, so for a Buddhist teacher to somehow say they're beyond ethics, or they don't have to worry about that, is saying they're somehow higher than the Buddha, which is a ludicrous position for a Buddhist teacher to uphold, right? And the Dalai Lama himself puts out, it's like he says there, he says, my own behavior, check. And he says, like, what's the word? There shouldn't be any differentiation between the private and the public practice. And if somebody finds that, point it out. He says that, right? He says, put it in the newspaper. Like he says of himself, he says, he encourages me. He says, please do that. That's not, because that's not, then I'd be contradicting the Buddhist approach, right? So again, what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is if you come across a Buddhist teacher who's saying, oh, I'm beyond ethics, or I'm above that, he's saying that's ludicrous, actually. Does that make sense? And if somebody's saying, because I can just rest, because remember this view that Hashang was saying, his view was, if you can just rest in non-conceptuality, that like you're above such mundane concerns as ethical behavior. And Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, there is nothing above ethical behavior. And Lama Tsongkhapa's actually view, if you understand later when we're going to discuss emptiness, is that emptiness means things lack their own intrinsic nature because they're interdependent. They're dependently arisen, right? And so if you understand that the meaning of emptiness is dependent, is that things are dependently arisen, then, then treating each other ethically is a natural side effect of understanding emptiness, right? Whereas if you understand emptiness, you understand, like, that I have no separate, right, independent essence, but that the nature the nature of how do I exist is interdependently, or is a dependently arisen phenomenon that's dependent upon many factors, including relational, right? And so if I don't treat others, and so if you understand that actually, then you understand, that no matter who I am, and no matter what spiritual level one is at, treating others with respect and dignity and ethics is an essential element of the spiritual path, and is also an essential, wanting to, the more one understands emptiness, the more one wants to do that, right? Because one understands I'm relational. Does that make sense? And if you somehow think, oh, I'm non-relational, I have some kind of non-conceptual, non-relational state, that's who I really am, he said, then Lama Tsongkhapa goes on to explain, then you've disregarded and deprecated the side of method, right, which means, for example, in this case, ethics, but you've also thrown emptiness out the window, because you've kind of asserted some kind of independent essence that's some non-conceptual thing that has nothing to do with emptiness. That's not the meaning of emptiness. Does that make sense? And so, and again, he makes this point that, because the meaning of emptiness comes about through individual investigation, and not through this method of meditation that's called of not thinking about anything. Does that make sense? So he's saying this idea that you just meditate by just not thinking about anything is wrong. I'll make one more point there, just as a side point. Also, there are, because in the West also this is an important point, and in the East too, but these days also, like at the beginning, for example, we did the meditation today of focusing on the sensation, right? Focusing on the breath, and when thoughts arise, we let them go and come back to the breath. Right? I want to make a point there. That's a very, actually, first of all, that method, right, which is comes from Buddhism, really. There's a focus on, it's one of the many methods that, the purpose of that is to calm one's mind down. Does that make sense? In our context. And to settle the mind, right? in order to then use the mind to cultivate these other states, bodhicitta or whatever, like, so it's an important point, like, there is even on our own meditation practice, to recognize what's the purpose of each meditation. Does that make sense? Actually, meditation on the sensations has other purposes too, potentially. The first one is just to calm our minds down. If you look in the sutra on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, right, which is where that comes from, the mindfulness, one of them is mindfulness of sensation. There are other purposes meditating on physical sensations. One is it's a method to understand the nature of suffering. Right? In other words, if one meditates deeply on the nature of physical sensation, one eventually comes to understand, oh wow, like when it comes to understand one's own experience of how do I suffer, you know, and how does suffering come about in my own experience, right? So even that method, there is eventually one investigates one's own experience introspectively. Does that make sense? Of one's own experience of sensation itself. Does that make sense? So if you understand, like in the 4 Foundations of Mindfulness Sutra, what the Buddha taught, the purpose of that is not just to blank your mind out of all thought. Whereas it's to get good at, what's the word, mindfully being aware of your sensations, so as then to be able to observe them and learn about your own experience. Does that make sense? So don't think that that method is just to blank out your mind. Sometimes people present it that way. I've had people where, sometimes where they'll sort of say, actually I remember this, like, actually I'll share it that way. Like I remember one time I was at a talk and somebody else was teaching, so like explaining mindfulness. And somebody said, oh, I had a bad session, I had a lot of thoughts. You know, she said, what are you talking about? Who said not to have thoughts? Like, you know, they said that wasn't the instruction. The instruction in this case was, if you have thoughts, notice them and come back to your sensation. That didn't say having thoughts is bad. Does that make sense? So people can easily misunderstand that instruction. And what's the word? It's so easy to tend towards this view of that Hashan tended towards. But in all these different ways, Lama Tsongkhapa is explaining why not to do that.
I think, Dr. Lauren, in my experience, the afflictions go down. That would be, quote unquote, the karma abiding part of it. It suppresses, not suppresses, it brings the afflictions down.
Yeah, maybe Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't make this point, but I'll just make since you said it, I'll say my own reflection. My own, like, one time I was talking to just a friend of mine about this topic, like, because he was pointing out he lives in California, he was saying, there are quite a few people in California who go around, like, presenting this view and saying and he was sort of noting that, you're right, in other words, that what does I say, right, that if somebody does this method that Hashan was teaching, and does it well, like if they spend a lot of time on it, there is a kind of, I'm sure this actually, well, I think of various things, but there is a kind of temporary suppression of the afflictive emotions that comes about. Because if you're not having, whereas if you're suppressing all your conceptual thoughts, you temporarily suppress at least some afflictive emotions, right? And that can, to some people, that can seem like a kind of enlightenment for themselves. So that, in other words, they may believe it actually. Right. But first of all, it's not. It is because you didn't understand emptiness. You're not practicing those other things. And then generosity and ethics and so on. But also, like from a Buddhist perspective, some teachers have pointed out, what's the karmic result? In other words, if your main spiritual practice becomes don't think, right? There is actually the karmic result is that you take rebirth as an animal. Usually, it's in karma. That's actually what they say. They say actually like because in other words, part of being human, part of the benefit of being human is our capacity for complex thought. And so, if somebody spends their human life cultivating a mind of non-thought, of like rejecting thought, and rejecting positive thoughts, even like compassion and loving kindness and ethics, they say that the result of that oftentimes will be rebirth in an animal realm that what somebody said. Somebody this is not in here, but one Lama pointed out like animals that are hibernating, like in the winter. Like it would be like they point out that would be like their retreat. That would be like a retreat, a spiritual retreat then. But it's not a spiritual retreat. They're just not thinking. Like they're asleep or something. Anyway, that's the part of what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying. But Next Lama Tsongkhapa goes, this does not occur on the side of meditation and emptiness either. However, okay, so next, Lama Tsongkhapa makes 2 points now. One is, he says, it's important to understand that, as we've already said the first of them, one is that this type of meditation is not a meditation on emptiness. One is not understanding emptiness. We already said that. Then he makes a point, but also, even in terms of actual meditation on emptiness, all the Buddhist scriptures of the Mahayana tradition point out that merely meditating on emptiness, even if one were correctly doing that, is not sufficient. In other words, that one also has to practice the other perfections, generosity, morality, and so on. And that, what's there say? Yeah, and that the path to Buddhahood requires all those different perfections. And there's a point there, which is that, they sometimes say wisdom only gives rise to there are two collections, they sometimes say, in the Buddhist practice, as a bodhisattva is progressing. One is the collection of wisdom, which gives rise to the truth body of a Buddha. In other words, to the Buddha's mind, really is what that means. But then also, part of the nature of Buddhahood is it being available to others, right? In service and in compassion and kindness, as a guide, a teacher, support to others. And in order to be supportive to others, as a Buddha, one has to give rise to the form bodies of a Buddha. And the cause of the form bodies of the Buddha are all those method practices. So, again, Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at reasoning. He's saying, Buddhahood is not just some kind of state for oneself. It's a relational state that includes manifesting to be of benefit to other beings. And he's pointing out, logically, if one isn't cultivating compassion, in what sense is one going to manifest for others? Compassion is the cause for manifesting for others. Then also, if one isn't practicing the other method aspects, morality and patience and so on, one isn't creating the cause to be present to others in an effective way. So it doesn't. So he's pointing out. So it makes no sense to say that mere wisdom alone is sufficient for being a Buddha, because the nature of a Buddha is to be a teacher, to be a guide, to be a helper to others. And then he makes and then in that regard, he also says that sometimes the state of Buddhahood is called non-abiding nirvana. Non-abiding means not abiding, on the one hand, not abiding in samsara, because you're no longer a samsaric suffering being, but also not abiding in a nirvana that's a kind of individual, separate piece, right? But instead, so non-abiding nirvana means one has achieved a nirvana in the sense of not having mental afflictions and not suffering, but one doesn't abide in that as a kind of separate state or some kind of disengagement from compassionate activity. Does that make sense? So Lama Tsongkhapa here says, okay, so what he's saying here is that there are two sides to that, method and wisdom, again. But what he's saying, I don't want to read it actually, not abiding in cyclic existence, meaning not abiding in samsara, is dependent upon the wisdom realizing suchness. Right? And he uses now, this is what I was just pausing, he's using different synonyms, so he's saying, you call it the wisdom realizing suchness, or the stage of the path, lying the ultimate, or the path of the profound. So what he's saying is these are all, synonyms, but he's saying to not abide in samsara means one has to realize emptiness, wisdom, the ultimate nature of reality. But then he's saying to not abide in individual peace, right, in this state of disengagement from compassion activity for others, one has to realize the path of the vast, or the collection of method, or the factor of merit. He uses, again, synonyms. But what he's saying is one has to also, to not abide in that individual peace, one has to have a kind of wisdom that's engaged with others, and that understands the nature of others' suffering, and others' karma, and the nature of their interdependent relationships that others exist in. And one also needs that kind of wisdom. And so Again, so a mere state of non-conceptuality, or a mere state of just emptiness even, would not be sufficient for that. That's what he's saying. And then he says, again, he's quoting a sutra here, but he says, the collection of exalted wisdom is what abandons the mental afflictions, right? So the cause of our suffering is the mental afflictions, and one has to have the wisdom, understanding the ultimate nature of reality to overcome those mental afflictions. But then he says, but it's also the nature of merit that is what fully nurtures others. And so he's saying, it's wisdom that uproots our own mental afflictions, but it's merit that allows us, that it's the merit or the positive karma or the method aspect of the path that allow us to become somebody capable of nurturing others with compassion. And so bodhisattvas simultaneously, that's not safe, but along the way at each stage of the path, cultivate both, and that's what we need to do. So again, you see, he's just presenting various reasonings to support this view. And then he quotes the Vilamakirti Sutra, which has been translated into English by Bob Thurman and also somebody else. And that sutra has an interesting quote. It says, somebody asked the Buddha, what is the bondage of bodhisattvas and what is their liberation? So he's saying, to a bodhisattva, what does it mean to be bound and what does it mean to be liberated? And the Buddha responds, wisdom not conjoined with method is bondage. Wisdom conjoined with method is liberation. Method not conjoined with wisdom is bondage. Method conjoined with wisdom is liberation. Okay. So he's saying either one apart from the other is still a form of bondage. And the implication there is that from a bodhisattva's perspective, just remaining in samsara as a suffering being, that's a kind of bondage, clearly, right? But to a bodhisattva remember, because from a bodhisattva's perspective, a bodhisattva views others' suffering, we said that before, like the way a mother would view their only child if they were drowning, right? And so from that perspective, to say, like to a bodhisattva to say just rest in some non-conceptual state and don't be available to others would be horrifying, right? It would mean I'm not going to be available to others to be, what it says, that's bondage. That's what that means, right? To a bodhisattva, that would be a horrifying bondage, right? To abandon others who are suffering would seem horrifying to the bodhisattva. So both are, so what he's saying is, to just be a samsaric being who's just suffering meaninglessly is obviously a form of bondage. But to rest in some sort of a non-conceptual separate place where one isn't available to be of service to others and be of help to others, that's also a horrifying kind of bondage. Wisdom without method would be a kind of a bondage or a horror, actually, to a bodhisattva. So you can see Lama Tsongkhapa he's strongly making this argument from various perspectives, because he doesn't want us to misunderstand that. And again, so that for yourself, so that if somebody eventually you're in some place and somebody says, oh, this is the meaning of Buddhism, that you can not just say, I think Lama Tsongkhapa disagreed with that, but you can say, what's my view? And what's the Buddha's view? And why would I think that? See, so he's getting at those points, right? So he says, the Bodhisattva, now he quotes another sutra, he says, the Bodhisattva path in brief is made up of two things. What are those two? Method and wisdom. And then he quotes, now he quotes Atisha in his Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment, which is the original beginning text for this genre of literature, right, the long run literature. So Atisha said, through wisdom divorced from the perfection practice, right, meaning method practices, the obscurations will not be exhausted. Therefore, in order to abandon all obscurations, afflictive and cognitive, the yoga of the perfection of wisdom should always be practiced combined with method. That is why method divorced from wisdom, as well as wisdom divorced from method, are referred to as bondage, and therefore one should not abandon either. So this is Atisha sort of explaining that previous quote, right, from the Vilamakirti Sutra. And part of what he's saying there too is that in order to overcome, what he said, afflictive and cognitive obscurations, this is a Buddhist perspective, again on Buddhahood. The first one overcomes the mental afflictions, right? Anger, hatred, jealousy, pride, and so on. And that's done through wisdom. But then one has to overcome the cognitive obscurations. What that means is obscurations to knowing in order to achieve what's in Buddhahood is sometimes described as omniscient, right? The omniscient state of Buddhahood. Meaning, what does that mean? It means that a Buddha understands most effectively how to help others, right? Understands causal factors and causes and conditions. And that in order to achieve that state, again, method is required, bodhicitta is required, the practice of 6 perfections is required. And the teacher goes on, omitting the perfection of wisdom, perfections of generosity and so forth, all the collections of virtue are explained by the Victor's method. So what he's saying is, of the 6 perfections, the first 5 perfections he's defining as method, and the last one, the perfection of wisdom, is the collection of wisdom. Just pausing. Yeah, I'm just going to pause. I mean, Lama Tsongkhapa is quoting more sutras, essentially saying the same point in various ways. Again, he's pointing out that you cannot achieve enlightenment without pure ethics, that you have to practice a combination of ethics and wisdom, and that you must practice, all 6 perfections, including generosity. I just want to pause and sort of, just want to see if there's something else here that before I. Okay, I'll pause there because we're just about out of time. The next section, Lama Tsongkhapa will go on to explain more about the reasons for that. He actually goes on just a little further to explain further logical reasoning here. He's been presented a number of general points, and he's going to present some more specific ones. But just coming back one last point, and then we'll stop. So you get the idea here, right? What he's really getting at is that, I'm going to make just a general point about this too, is that from a Buddhist perspective, remember, everything is, the key Buddhist teaching is dependent origination. So one point is, just blanking out your mind and being non-conceptual is not sufficient. Another point though is that there is no state in Buddhism there's no goal and there's no state in Buddhism that's disconnected, right? Or that's some kind of escape. Does that make sense? This idea of non-abiding nirvana, right? That means that a Buddha is not trying to escape to some other place. Right? There's not some place to run away to. The idea is one wants to as it said, right? One wants to become a Buddha. One overcomes one's own mental afflictions, one's obscurations to knowledge, right? But the state of Buddhahood is a state of ultimate engagement with others. Does that make sense? There's the idea that sometimes people have that enlightenment is some kind of disengaged escape, state of escape, is just wrong, actually. And that's what Lama Tsongkhapa, non-abiding nirvana, right, means one has achieved a kind of cessation of mental afflictions, as I said, so one has achieved a state of peace internally, but one is actually more fully engaged with others and more capable of engaging with others fully in the state of Buddhahood out of compassion. Does that make sense? And so this idea of because what he's getting at in part is that this view of Hashan is a sort of disengagement, right? A sort of don't think about anything, just sort of be in some kind of state. It's an attempt to really to disengage from compassion, which is in some ways, and again, this is what Lama Tsongkhapa was saying, is that, so in some ways, not only is that not what the Buddha taught, but in one sense, that's the opposite of the intent of Buddhism. Does that make sense? So again, he's he doesn't use those words, but I'm using it to kind of further elaborate, that this idea of sort of some kind of disengaged, non-conceptual state where compassion is beneath me or something, in one sense would be kind of a horrifying idea, actually, from a Buddhist perspective. Because the very idea of Buddhism is compassionate engagement with the world. So that was kind of my summary of what I was saying. Okay, let's stop there. We can do the 2 verses of dedication. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it rise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara.